And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Friday, January 3rd, 2025. And we'll start out with the ice across the far north, the Beaufort Sea. We have ice deeply in place. There are some plenias offshore there, west of Yavik, Wainwright, and northwest there at Point Lay. As we drop down through the Bering Strait, plenty of ice, and the ice there along the west coast has expanded to encompass St. Lawrence Island, and with the offshore east-northeast winds, this ice will have a tendency to want to drift westward through the course of the weekend. We have a shot of Arctic air that continues to be transported westward. The winds aloft, a few thousand or more feet above the surface, are quite strong. So again, the overall tendency will be for that ice to shift westward across the northern Bering. Looking at the synoptic map late tonight into Saturday morning, we have a few areas of low pressure in the North Pacific, south of the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutians, with kind of this washing out occluded front. And then another frontal system, as that takes shape, lifts north, it will weaken. This trough that did bring some snow to areas of the Panhandle will still provide the potential for some snow along the northern Gulf Coast. We have winter weather advisories in effect for areas around Yakutat, winter storm watch for northern Panhandle, especially Saturday night into Sunday night. 6 to 12 inches of snow along areas of the Haines and Klondike highways. The big high pressure that was over northwest Canada will begin to break down, and the overall pattern shift will start to take shape later this weekend. We're going to see a return moist southerly flow of air coming up out of the North Pacific. It'll be in the form of a series of moist low pressure systems that are going to bring some high winds, heavier rains along the coast, snow to the coastal mountains. Some very hefty snows will fall over the next week, especially areas around Prince William Sound, Valdez, Yakutat, McCarthy, really going to get blasted with heavy snowfall over the next week into next weekend. By Sunday afternoon, we have the initial trough just kind of there to the north, initial lead low, but then here comes a stronger low. This will be a moist system, and that's going to take a track northerly and force a lot of moisture up here along areas of the northern, northeastern Gulf Coast, northern Panhandle. So keep that in mind, because this is something that'll repeat itself as we go through next week, probably at least a couple of more times. So marine forecast for the Panhandle Saturday. North winds, we could see 25-30 knot north winds, Stevens Passage, Lynn Canal, waves 5-7 feet. Gust to 40 knots there, Stevens Passage. East winds 15 knots here, Dixon Entrance outside of Ketchikan, Metlakatla. The outer Gulf Coast, generally easterly winds anywhere from 25 to as high as 35 knots outside of the Icy Strait and off of Cape Suckling, waves 8 to as high as 13 feet. Sunday, we find winds northerly still 25 knots, gusts there in Stevens Passage, waves 4-5 feet. Southeast winds gusting as high as 35 knots, Dixon Entrance, 4-foot waves. The outer coast, southeast to east winds continue with gusts of 40 knots there outside of the Icy Strait and 40-knot sustained gale force winds around Cape Suckling. Saturday's winds will be rather strong too. Gale force northeasterly winds 40 to 45 knots, middle lower Cook Inlet to northeast of Kodiak Island, waves 10 to 12 feet there. Upper Cook Inlet and Prince William Sound, northeast winds 20 to 25 knots with waves running 4 feet, and winds east-northeast 30 to 35 knots outside of Cape Suckling and Hinchinbrook Entrance rather. And then across Kodiak Island Saturday, 40 knot northeast gales there within Shelikof Strait, 11-foot waves. Going down the North Pacific side of the peninsula, northeast winds 30 to 35 knots. Bering side, 25 knot northeast winds outside of Bristol Bay to north of Cold Bay. Waves there 5 to 6 feet, but as high as 10 to 12 feet on the North Pacific side. For Sunday, we have that other low beginning to come north, so winds east-southeast winds around Kodiak Island around 30 knots. And as we get down here on the backside, on the Bering side of things, northeast winds right around 30 knots, 6 to 8 foot waves. And for Saturday, across the Aleutians, winds will generally be easterly, eastern central Aleutians 20 to 25 knots. We get west of Adak, though, we have East to northeast gales 35 to 40 knots, especially north and west of Kiska, where waves could exceed 20 feet. And then on Sunday, winds will be north over the far eastern Aleutians, 15 knots around on Alaska, becoming easterly 15 knots through Atka and Adak. And then again, northeasterly gales around 35 knots or so, especially north side of Kiska up towards Shimia, with 20-foot waves. Offshore flow continues along the west coast. We've had that push of Arctic air. It continues out over the Bering. 35-knot northeasterly gales out of Norton Sound along the lower Yukon coast. 40-knot gales St. Matthew. And again, that ice is going to have a tendency to pull westward as a result of that strong northeasterly offshore flow. For Sunday, not that much changes. Winds generally 25 to 30 knot easterly winds, offshore flow all along the coast from Bristol Bay up to Norton Sound. Again, the ice wanting to shift westward, maybe even a little bit of a southward drift. Still 40-knot gales with 18-foot waves around St. Matthew. Through the Bering Strait, we find northeast winds of 25 knots through the lower Chukchi Sea, as high as 35 knots on the north side of St. Lawrence Island. Again, enough wind. There could be some shifting of ice up along the Beaufort Sea coast. Northeast winds 10 to 15 knots, Utqiagvik through Prudhoe Bay. Kaktovik, more of a west wind at 10 knots. And then on Sunday, easterly winds set up there at Kaktovik to 25 knots. Easterly northeast winds 10 to 15 knots. Prudhoe Bay, and then they pick up through the lower Chukchi Sea. We'll find northeast winds increasing to 25 to 30 knots there from Cape Lisburne south, outside of Kotzebue Sound, and then down through the Bering Strait before turning northerly. And we expect winds that on the north side of St. Lawrence Island, especially toward Gambell, we could be looking at 35-knot northerly gales for the day Sunday.